We are back. I don't know about you, but I'm ready to read some Schofield Strategic Nuclear Sharing. We're on Chapter 4, Nuclear Proliferation Races and Non-Proliferation Bargains. I'm sure this is going to be a doozy. I've got my water ready for whenever I become tired or dehydrated, and I'm going to try to go as far as I can. So put in your earbuds, grab a snack, or hop in the shower, or go on your run, whatever you're going to do, and let the book begin. All right. Chapter 4, Nuclear Proliferation Races and Non-Proliferation Bargains. The perception of threat resulting from nuclear sharing can provoke retaliation in kind, resulting in a competitive nuclear proliferation race between donors. Nuclear sharing happens when states face incentives to share, and nuclear proliferation races happen when states fail to resist them. States may seek to infiltrate and roll back another state's sphere of influence, augment the strength of a neutral or ally whose remoteness might have led it to bandwagon with its adversary, or reinforce the strength of the members of an alliance. However, states anticipate actions and outcomes, and in certain instances they can bargain mutual restraints on nuclear sharing. Typically, these bargains become possible when donor states have something to lose, usually because they become concerned with the arming of their enemies. States with nothing to lose will have no incentive to discontinue proliferating. There is little developed theory on proliferation races as they are rare, primarily because those that could have occurred have been arrested by joint state action. It is not at all certain that proliferation races have an equilibrium that is self-terminating and prone to bargains. Non-proliferation bargains provide a better explanation for why states forego nuclear sharing than the intervention model proposition that states seek to preserve their ability to intervene. This is principally because states will sacrifice their ability to intervene for improved security. First, nuclear proliferation races. The two principal cases of nuclear proliferation racing were during the early Cold War and the early phase of the US-China competition starting in the early 1990s. Early in the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the US were engaged in a wide spectrum but disjointed security competition, including a nascent proliferation race. The initial disposition of both sides was to share nuclear weapons with their respective allies. Moscow was concerned with the US invasion of Soviet-occupied Eastern Europe and China, and the US and its European allies were concerned with an invasion by the Soviet Union. Nuclear sharing was thought to be able to alleviate these threats. The Soviet Union's response in the mid-1950s to superior US nuclear reach was to give nuclear weapons technology to China, and then in October of 1962, it stationed nuclear weapons in Cuba and later briefly considered giving nuclear weapons to the Havana government. The Soviet Union believed that the US was covertly and jointly developing its nuclear arsenal with its closest allies, the UK and France, and was prepared to do so also with West Germany and other global allies. Moscow viewed the US deployment of a wide variety of nuclear-capable missiles under partial foreign control, Thor in the UK, Jupiter in Italy and Turkey, Honest Johns in Greece, South Korea, Turkey, and Taiwan, as part of a dangerous attempt to diffuse nuclear military power on Soviet borders. The Soviet Union would periodically retaliate against these. In August of 1961, in reaction to French tests, which Moscow wrongly believed were shared with the US and UK, the Soviet Union broke its testing moratorium with a run of 59 nuclear detonations in 2 weeks. In 1963, due to persistent concerns that the US would further aid France and West Germany, it already was sharing nuclear weapons technology with the UK, Moscow refused to cooperate against anticipated Chinese nuclear testing. The most serious nuclear sharing threat faced by the Kremlin, however, which triggered the 1961 Berlin crisis, ended the Soviet-US proliferation race and ultimately led to the creation of the 1968 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, and that was the fear in Moscow that the US would provide nuclear weapons to Germany. Thereafter, the US and Soviet response to nuclear proliferation was to provide extended deterrence by stationing nuclear weapons rather than by nuclear sharing. The later Soviet response to mature French and Chinese nuclear arsenals in the 1970s was to develop the SS-20 and the Tupolev 26 bomber. The USSR, for its part, had always viewed the Manhattan Project as a joint US, British, Canadian, France effort, and Moscow viewed it as the point of instigation for the proliferation race. When the US was later perceived to be cheating in its permissive support to Israel, South Africa, and Pakistan, there was sufficient plausible deniability to restrain Moscow. A second Sino-US proliferation race began in the 1980s with the encroachment of China on US interests in the Middle East and Asia. China's active proliferation support to Pakistan in the 1970s and Iran in the 1980s, and its permissive support to North Korea in the 1990s were all designed to enhance Beijing's strategic or commercial interests. The US and China negotiated a preliminary bargain against nuclear sharing that excluded Iran from China's assistance in the early 1990s, and China agreed to restrict the sale of certain nuclear systems to Pakistan once Pakistan became self-sufficient in missiles and fission warheads. In exchange, the US cooperated with Beijing on Taiwan and helped China integrate into the world economy. The 1998 nuclear tests in India and Pakistan triggered the US and China to provide significant nuclear infrastructure assistance to their respective allies, assistance whose goal is to increase fissile materials production in each state from 7 to 50 warheads per annum by 2020 or 2030. Thus far, the US has sought to restrain its allies, particularly Japan, South Korea, and Australia, whose own nuclear weapons programs would push China to seek a nuclear breakout. This could possibly also fracture the US-led alliance. There was some concern after India's 1974 nuclear test that it could share nuclear weapons, but the New Delhi government quickly asserted that it would not provide nuclear assistance to other states. India has criticized Sino-Pakistani nuclear cooperation, but has not threatened to retaliate by engaging in a proliferation race. There is also no evidence that West Germany, Japan, or Sweden contemplated enabling other states to obtain nuclear weapons or to pursue or provoke nuclear proliferation races despite their advanced nuclear technologies. Next, cooperative non-proliferation. Cooperative non-proliferation, when adversaries agree to stop spreading the bomb, is not automatic and depends on careful negotiation and agreement on where the boundary lines lie for their respective spheres of influence. States choose to pursue joint and cooperative non-proliferation strategies with their adversaries when attempts to spread nuclear weapons to their allies, in part because these states' proliferation efforts can be linked back to their patron, provoke an evident counter-response in their adversary. A contributing factor is that the competing adversaries have achieved some form of strategic parity, where both parties have no further major gains to be made from continued proliferation. In the case of the Cold War, the emerging ICBM force in the USSR permitted it to achieve approximate strategic parity by 1966 and 1967, setting the stage for cooperative non-proliferation negotiations. These nuclear bargains between adversaries are typically tacit or embedded in other formal agreements, such as the 1968 NPT, as making a formal agreement is too provocative, particularly in the conjoined isolation of their minor allies. When these circumstances are not present, states fail to agree to an arrangement. States may come to the realization of the benefits of cooperation after a crisis. The cases examined below include US-Soviet non-proliferation cooperation, Soviet-Chinese non-proliferation cooperation, and US-China non-proliferation cooperation. In adversarial relations, states are sensitive to losses and relative gains. They are therefore reluctant to cooperate forcefully in anti-proliferation efforts against third parties, which are not a direct threat to them, and they do not want to set precedents leading to their own proxies becoming targets. Although states often consider the possibility of neutralizing proxies, they do not acquiesce to their opponents doing so because this may reduce the state's relative power. The US has considered conducting preventive attacks against a near-nuclear state on a number of occasions. These include planned attacks against the imminently nuclear USSR in 1949 and against China with Taiwanese encouragement in 1964. In 1964, the Soviet Union refused to consider joint military action with the US against China's imminent nuclear test. Israel was concerned that Egypt would strike Israel in 1967, and the prevailing evidence suggests that the Soviets instigated a preventive war through Egypt and Syria. India considered a preemptive attack against Pakistan's nuclear infrastructure in the 1980s. Israel did preempt Iraq on June 7, 1981, but within the context of an ongoing war in which Iran had already struck the Osirak reactor site in question. Next, Cold War cooperative nonproliferation in Europe. The NPT of 1968 has its origins in a grand bargain between the US and the Soviet Union to jointly contain proliferation among their allies during the competition of the Cold War. At its core, the NPT is a Soviet-US treaty on denuclearization of West Germany. It is the cornerstone for the subsequent denuclearization of Europe and East Asia, and only secondarily does it matter as a multilateral non-proliferation framework. The NPT is itself a hard-fought compromise on how to accommodate the problems of Germany, France, and China. The arrangement evolved as a series of adaptations and increases in mutual understanding. In a 1954 letter to Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, 1953 to 1964, U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower, 1953 to 1961, stated that the U.S. had no intention of sharing nuclear weapons or production information with allies, but increases in Soviet bomber-equipped nuclear capability quickly eroded that assurance. When, in 1960, Eisenhower stated his intention to change the Atomic Energy Act to enable European allies to obtain nuclear weapons, Khrushchev threatened to do the same, and Kennedy quickly reversed his position. At first, the Soviet Union, disadvantaged by the fact that it was surrounded by the territory of hostile states where the US could deploy nuclear missiles, put greater emphasis on the dangers of foreign basing than nuclear sharing. Moscow reacted with measured hostility to the deployment by the US of Jupiter missiles in Turkey from 1961 to 1963, and Italy from 1961 to 1963, and Thor missiles 1958 to 1963 in the UK, and later to the deployment in West Germany of the Pershing 1965 to 1986 and Pershing 1A 1969 to 1991 missiles. Mouthful. The Soviet Union tried to escape this encirclement by seeking unsuccessfully to establish ballistic missile submarine bases in China, deploy R-12 missiles in Cuba in October of 1962, and ultimately proposed but abandoned a clause in the 1966 draft of the NPT that sought to ban foreign basing of nuclear weapons. This concern was eclipsed in Moscow by the fear of a West German nuclear arsenal. Next, the German problem. The rearmament of Germany in 1954 to 1955 triggered the formation of the Warsaw Pact and led to the apprehension in the Soviet Union that Germany would eventually seek nuclear weapons, and much of Moscow's foreign policy was geared to avoiding that outcome. When a Soviet proposal for a nuclear-free zone, or NFZ, in Central Europe failed, and with it attempts to exclude US nuclear missile basing, Moscow triggered the 1958 Berlin crisis. Moscow was fearful of a reassertive German foreign policy, particularly in attempts to reunify East Germany and territory annexed by Poland, and fear of revenge made feasible by a German nuclear arsenal. While popular sentiment in Germany remained consistently against a nuclear arsenal, among its political elite, interest in this was high in the late 1950s. Their central interest was to leverage the right to possess, or actual possession, and eventually barter them for reunification with East Germany. Germany sought cooperation with Italy and France as early as 1957 to establish a dual-capable nuclear infrastructure, and in 1958 discussed with France the prospects of obtaining access to French nuclear weapons. Interesting. Germany was also seeking to obtain nuclear weapons from the US under a variety of control architectures to provide for its security. The CIA estimated that Germany could develop a missile with 1,500-kilometer range by 1966, and that an independent German nuclear arsenal would lead to the fragmentation of NATO. The US therefore made it a priority to provide West Germany highly credible extended nuclear deterrence, which in the circumstances meant granting access to dual-key custodial nuclear warheads as early as 1958. The Soviet Union was highly critical of the US decision to share jointly controlled nuclear warheads, and was concerned that Germany would be able to seize or obtain the technical data to make its own operational warheads, despite US assurances that this was not possible. As late as 1967, Moscow accused Germany's substantial nuclear energy industry of being a cover for a nuclear weapons option. The US proposal to assuage German security interests was for a multilateral nuclear force, or MLF, within NATO. Its goal was to give European NATO members joint and immediate control over a regrouped multinational nuclear force of ballistic missile submarines, but it was resisted by the British and French, who did not want to see their nuclear weapons absorbed by the alliance. Moscow was again critical because the proposal would grant Germany even greater technical access than before. The political and proliferation shock of China's October 1964 nuclear test crippled the MLF proposal and returned Germany to its default reliance on dual-key systems. In May of 1965, the US floated and was surprised to find its NATO allies receptive to the idea of an establishment of a permanent committee that would discuss operational details of nuclear weapons on a continual basis, something the US had avoided doing earlier because of its sensitivity. The first meeting in 1966 would lead to the creation of NATO's seven-member Nuclear Planning Group, or NPG, in 1967. The NPG discussed both tactical and strategic nuclear weapon effects and doctrines, and was the chief input for European influence on US policy. The detail and depth provided by the NPG satisfied German interests in influencing nuclear deterrent policy in Europe, coupled with the confidence of operating for nearly 10 years with dual-key US warheads. It effectively dissipated the German bid for an independent nuclear arsenal. For Moscow, the US-German dual-key warhead arrangement from 1958 had not changed, but it had learned that it was preferable to an MLF, and learned to accept that either the Europeans would be united under a US dual-key system, or they would operate a myriad of independent arsenals. Next, the Chinese problem. China posed a problem of a proliferator that resisted aggressively the non-proliferation proposals of both Moscow and Washington. China had itself approached the USSR in 1962 to 1963 and warned Moscow not to promise any curtailment of their nuclear weapons program. In particular, Khrushchev was concerned from mid-1958 on with what the world reaction would be when it was disclosed that the Soviet Union had provided significant assistance to China's nuclear weapons program. In part, it undermined his argument for a denuclearization of Germany, and despite assurances that China was decades away from a substantial arsenal, it also posed a threat to Soviet security. The Soviet experience of providing China with nuclear assistance and Beijing's subsequent move to test a nuclear device in 1964 rendered Moscow much more cautious about nuclear proliferation. The USSR had also considered the possibility that the US would retaliate for Soviet aid to China with further proliferation. Next, the French problem. The French problem centered on the belief in Moscow that France was a nuclear proxy of the US, covertly supported in its nuclear research by Washington. In retaliation for French tests in 1959 and 1960, which Moscow saw as part of Western collusion, the Soviet Union broke its three-year moratorium on nuclear testing in 1961. The USSR accused the US and UK of delaying negotiations on a limited test ban treaty, or LTBT, to enable France to complete its nuclear weapons development. It became natural then to offer exchanges. In 1960, Khrushchev offered to deliver China's denuclearization for that of West Germany, although Moscow rescinded the offer in 1961 when the US asked for an exchange between France and China. Furthermore, by 1962, China had drifted too far from the Soviet Union, and the US did not want to do anything that would propel them back together. Next, the 1968 NPT bargain. Already by 1960, there was a resolution at the UN passed unanimously on December 4th, 1961, which contained the basic text of the NPT. However, the conditions for reaching a US-Soviet nuclear nonproliferation bargain, specifically for the US to denuclearize Germany, in exchange for which the Soviet Union would curtail any further nuclear sharing, were not yet satisfied in 1958 when Ireland made its first proposals for an NPT. First, the outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis led both sides to agree to a delineation of their respective spheres of influence and a tacit promise of non-interference within them. Second, by 1958, the US, USSR, and UK had all tested thermonuclear weapons, and so began a series of arms control agreements cementing their advantage, including testing moratoria, culminating in the LTBT of 1963, and treaties banning nuclear weapons in space, in Antarctica, and on the seabed. Third, French and Chinese nuclear tests, in particular in 1964, gave impetus to negotiations to prevent further proliferation, coupled with a mutual recognition that France and China were undeliverable by either side. Fourth, by 1963, the US believed that there would be no further realignment of states, and that nuclear proliferation races would be unlikely. It was believed that, by then, nuclear proliferation would mostly have an effect on escalation and inter-alliance relations. Finally, in exchange for its demands to end the MLF and ensure Germany remained denuclearized, Moscow had to accept the dual-key nuclear warhead arrangements the US had in place with its NATO allies since 1958, as well as the NPG. Accepting this sharing agreement then cleared Germany's agreement to sign the NPT, which was always a condition for Soviet accession. Accession? The importance of the NPT to Soviet goals of denuclearizing Germany made it Moscow's highest diplomatic priority between 1964 and 1968. For its part, the US obtained Soviet agreement not to support nuclear proliferation, a policy Moscow followed stringently until the end of the Cold War. For example, only one of its exported reactors, built in Czechoslovakia, ever used highly enriched uranium. France, for its part, reassured the US that it would not share nuclear weapons, despite its intention not to sign the NPT at the time. The persistence of and exceptions to the US-Soviet non-proliferation bargain. The NPT proved remarkably persistent because as long as the US managed the German problem on behalf of the Soviet Union, Moscow had a disincentive to proliferate in the developing world. The 1975 Helsinki Accords further cemented the mutual recognition of their respective spheres of influence. The US and USSR reasserted their commitment to the principles of their non-proliferation bargain in a November 1985 joint statement. For salient programs, the US could enlist the cooperation of the Soviet Union in impeding developing world proliferation. For example, Moscow cooperated with the US in restricting the sale of dual-use space launch vehicle technology to India, resulting in significant delays to India's missile program. The Soviet Union was fairly strict against sharing nuclear weapons and advanced missile technology with its allies, including the Warsaw Pact states. However, in the missile field, the USSR was eager for commercial returns, and so did not emulate the US missile embargo of the developing world from 1961 to 1974, broken when Washington sold Lance missiles to Israel. There was, however, some cooperation to improve the 1987 Missile Technology Control Regime, or MTCR. Moscow had accused the US of active non-interference with the proliferation of nuclear weapons to proxy states and regions of interest to the US, specifically Israel, Pakistan, South Africa, and India. Most of these had an effect on Soviet client states, but were outside of the USSR's sphere of influence and vital areas of interest, and so did not imperil their non-proliferation bargain. For example, during the war in Afghanistan in the 1980s, the Reagan administration certified Pakistan as not pursuing a nuclear option, which was clearly not the case. The US obtained a promise from Islamabad in 1984 not to enrich uranium, but when Pakistan was caught enriching uranium, the US easily acquiesced to a second promise not to do so. In the 1980s, South African confrontation with Angola and Mozambique, two of Moscow's southern African client states, led to a US blunting of International Atomic Energy Agency or IAEA criticism of South Africa's proliferation efforts. In 1981, the US encouraged its European allies to sell enriched uranium to South Africa. When, in 1977, the Soviet Union confronted the US over an imminent nuclear test in South Africa, the US asked its allies to provide a private reassurance to Pretoria to soften its harsh public criticism. The USSR accused the US of permitting the Saudi importation of DF-3 or NATO CSS-2 rockets from China in 1987. For Moscow, US treatment of Israel, South Africa, and Pakistan all looked like soft balancing and permissive nuclear sharing. For its part, the Soviet Union's response to the evolution of US-NATO dual-key arrangement in the 1970s and 80s, which it perceived as a form of loaned nuclear sharing, was to compensate for it by deploying significant additional theater missile forces in Europe. Interesting. That's a good link. During the Cold War in Northeast Asia, the US and USSR found common interest in denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula. The US goal was to preserve a similar state in South Korea and Japan, and thereby preserve the outlines of its regional strategic architecture. The US consequently pursued measures to ensure South Korea remained that way after Seoul twice in the mid-1970s and mid-1980s began the outlines of weapons-related nuclear research. When the US pressured South Korea to sign the NPT in 1975, and the USSR followed with North Korea in 1979. However, in the 1980s, the Soviet Union's influence in Pyongyang suffered a relative decline compared with that of China. Though a US-Russian non-proliferation bargain persists, the aggressive entry of NATO into Russia's Eastern European sphere of influence has led Moscow to reassert itself and bend the spirit of the bargain. NATO has thus far been very careful not to spread its dual-key nuclear arrangement into Eastern Europe. Russia is clearly pursuing a soft balancing proliferation strategy with regard to Iran. Russia has helped Iran's nuclear-related industry through visits by implosion experts, provision of high-speed cameras and heavy water reactor fuel along Russian designs, and with Iranians being trained in Russia, although the US has certified that Russia has done little after 2007 to assist Iran's alleged weapons program. Russia has also been far more reluctant to support aggressive US non-proliferation policy against either North Korea or Iran. Next, North Korea in the communist camp. While Moscow and Beijing sought formal relations with Pyongyang, neither were in competition for influence, and they shared a tacit understanding not to facilitate proliferation on the peninsula. The Soviet Union assisted North Korea with a 4-megawatt research reactor at Yongbyon in 1962, and later upgraded it to use 80% HEU, from which North Korea managed to extract some plutonium in the 1970s, as well as training for hundreds of scientists. When the USSR was asked by North Korea to help it extract uranium ore, the USSR inquired whether North Korea was seeking to develop nuclear weapons. Kim Il-sung requested direct nuclear assistance from both the USSR and China, though both refused, probably collusively. North Korea consequently approached East Germany for help in 1963, 1967, and 1981, stating explicitly that North Korea was seeking nuclear weapons. Czechoslovakia was approached in 1979 for a request for a nuclear reactor as well. In 1976, North Korea threatened to suspend economic relations with the USSR if it did not receive a nuclear power plant, which the Soviets refused. In 1990, the USSR terminated all nuclear-related exchanges until North Korea accepted full-scope safeguards. Between 1961 and 1968, the Soviet Union provided North Korea with facilities for the maintenance of SA-2 SAMs, as well as 27 Frog 5 missiles with 9 tractor erector launchers, or TEL, which may have been readapted for Scud upgrades. China had provided missile engineering training to the North Koreans starting in 1971, and then assisted North Korea in upgrading its missile maintenance facilities so that it was building indigenous HQ-2 and HY-1 anti-ship missiles during the late 1970s. When the Soviet Union refused to supply North Korea with Scud missiles, North Korea reverse-engineered missiles purchased from Egypt, then an emerging US ally. Neither Moscow nor Beijing intended North Korea to go nuclear, but neither was willing to confront Pyongyang during its nuclear effort. Next, the China-US nuclear nonproliferation bargain. China was initially hostile to US-Soviet nonproliferation agreements, which it saw as an attempt to curtail its efforts to secure nuclear weapons, and was a rhetorical proponent of the right of states to proliferate. However, once China conducted its fission tests in October of 1964, its rhetoric waned, and it did not begin nuclear collaboration until nearly a decade later with Pakistan, after India detonated its peaceful nuclear explosive in 1974. For example, in 1965, China either refused or did not comment on an Indonesian request to detonate a Chinese nuclear weapon there to intimidate Australia. China's experience of confronting a nuclear weapon-equipped US in the Korean War from 1950 to 1953 and the Taiwan Straits crisis from 1954 to 1955 and again in 1958 had largely immunized it to the fear of peaceful nuclear compellence, and it was therefore not overly insecure. It also came to realize over the decades that nuclear weapons were not particularly useful for defreezing the Taiwan issue. The interregnum between its nuclear test of 1964 and the Cultural Revolution effectively slowed the pace of its own missile and warhead development, a pace which was kept slow until the end of the century to enable economic development. From 1981, China limited itself to only approximately 18 DF-5 ICBMs able to strike at Moscow and the continental US. The DF-31s became operational only in 2003. From the late 1970s, China exported sensitive technology for commercial reasons. Missiles were delivered to Iran, Iraq, Syria, North Korea, and Saudi Arabia, and nuclear-related materials to Argentina, Brazil, Pakistan, and even India and South Africa. By 1954, the US had accepted the strategic status quo in Asia with regard to China, and anticipating China's nuclear test, Washington reassured its allies of the protection of its nuclear umbrella. The immediate effect of this was to lead to a dampening of interest in nuclear weapons in Australia and Japan. US Secretary of State Dean Rusk, who was Secretary of State from 1961 to 1969, had considered the measure of sharing nuclear weapons with India and Japan in the event of a Chinese nuclear test, but the nuclear challenge emerging from China turned out to be weak and far less of a concern than the Soviet strategic buildup of the 1970s. China, for its part, understood in 1961 that it could avoid war with the US by not provoking it. As early as 1965, China's foreign minister, Chen Yi, stated that China would not share nuclear weapons with other states, effectively declaring a unilateral commitment against nuclear sharing. In 1985, Beijing again promised the US it would not share or deploy its nuclear weapons abroad. An important issue for China, but less so than Germany, was for the Soviet Union, but less so than Germany was for the Soviet Union, is the potential nuclear weaponization of Japan. Both Rusk and the US Air Force proposed plans as early as 1961 to provide nuclear weapons to US allies in Asia, including Japan. Premier Zhou Enlai, Zhou Enlai, from 1949 to 1976, voiced this apprehension in the early 1970s. China was concerned that the US could prod Japan toward nuclear capability, thereby circumscribing China's influence in East Asia. Observers frequently point to the fact that Japan's signing of the NPT was conditional on it being permitted to develop a significant nuclear technological base, mainly to preserve a nuclear option. Japan also exerted considerable influence on the US, interfering, for example, in the Intermediate Range Force or INF Treaty by pressuring the US to dismantle rather than relocate Soviet SS-20 missiles to East Asia, as Moscow had initially proposed. Beijing did recognize, however, that there is a joint interest with the US in preserving the status quo, as a nuclearized Japan would undermine the US's alliance architecture in East Asia. The contours of a US-China non-proliferation bargain began as a US attempt to socialize a China seeking commercial engagement with the world in the early 1980s. It received further impetus when the US's 1993 bottom-up review and the 1995 National Security Strategy both identified proliferation as one of the US's leading security priorities. China joined the IAEA in 1984 and declared it would not share nuclear weapons technology with other states. It subsequently agreed to abide by the MTCR in 1991, signed the NPT in 1992, and joined the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, or CTBT, in 1996, the Zaniger Committee in 1997, and the Nuclear Suppliers Group in 2004. Between 1987 and 2004, the US pressured China to comply with these and other arms control agreements, particularly with regard to nuclear and missile proliferation, in the case of Iran, North Korea, and Pakistan, to which China eventually agreed. China, for its part, has linked its treaty compliance to US non-interference over Taiwan. For example, China's sale of missiles to Pakistan and Iran in 1992 was in response to the US sale of 100 F-16s to Taiwan, which was itself a response to the Russian sale of Su-27s to China. That's interesting. That would have been a cool link on the Taiwan topic. China has significantly curtailed its nuclear and missile technology transfers to Iran, North Korea, and Pakistan in response to US concerns. This is mostly driven by China's desire to create a non-confrontational international environment conducive to economic development and China's peaceful rise. China's proliferation of technology transfers to Iran, beginning in the 1980s, was driven by commercial considerations, although US pressure and the emerging US-China non-proliferation bargain in Asia led to a cutting off of that support, particularly missile and nuclear expertise, in 1997. While China is not known to have provided Pyongyang with strategic missile or nuclear assistance, Beijing does make the survival of the regime a priority in order to preserve North Korea as a territorial buffer state. It has thus far been reluctant to change its permissive attitude toward North Korea's nuclear weapons program. China is aware that North Korea may provoke proliferation in Japan or South Korea. In South Asia, where nuclear arsenals have already been established in India and Pakistan, the US and China have tacitly agreed to maintain a strategic balance. In the case of India, this means Chinese acquiescence to the US-Indian 123 nuclear agreement, in which the importation of US civilian nuclear fuel and technology frees up India's indigenous supply of fissile material for military applications, such as warhead production. The US, for its part, does not formally object to Chinese-Pakistan nuclear cooperation, nor raise objections at the NSG regarding China's construction of nuclear reactors within Pakistan. China's assistance to Pakistan is consequently in the development of safeguarded facilities, and it has curtailed the export of missiles such as the M11 that were not MTCR compliant. China could do this in part because it had assisted Pakistan to the point of self-sufficiency and agreed in 1996 not to provide any further cooperation on unsafeguarded facilities in Pakistan. In 2005, China began helping Pakistan build a second reactor at Chasma, and in April 2010 began the construction of two more. Against weak US objections that China was violating its earlier NSG commitments, Beijing responded that its assistance was being grandfathered in the same way that the US-Indian 123 agreement was an exception to the NPT. China's persistent support to Pakistan seems less of a direct challenge to the nuclear bargain than compensatory soft balancing on behalf of its regional ally in order to inoculate Pakistan against any nuclear intimidation from India. Although it took longer to develop, the US and China have tacitly reached an understanding about the limits of nuclear sharing in Northeast Asia, in North Korea, in which China's interests predominate, in South Asia, where the US and China have agreed to indirectly assist their allies to improve their respective nuclear infrastructures, and the Middle East, where China's nuclear sharing is locked out. This bargain is nevertheless still evolving, particularly over the boundaries of Washington and Beijing's competitive soft sharing with their respective Indian and Pakistani proxies. Conclusion. Nuclear proliferation races are unusual but potentially destabilizing phenomena. States that discover they have an opportunity to avoid points of common aversion may bargain mutual restraint. The early US-Soviet proliferations race spread from the Soviet Union to China and from the US to its NATO allies. The experience of German rearmament, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the failure of the MLF, and China's 1964 test put Washington and Moscow on course for a non-proliferation bargain, which has persisted beyond the end of the Cold War. The NPT's essential outline was a trade between US restraint of German nuclearization and Soviet agreement against nuclear sharing everywhere else. The bargain survived because the threat of German nuclearization has never abated. In contrast, the Sino-US non-proliferation bargain emerged in the 1980s, a decade after China had been assisting Pakistan, and largely as an attempt by the US to socialize China into the commercial world it was engaging. This bargain is more complex and uneven, with considerable room for further renegotiation. China, for example, is permitting its proxy North Korea to provoke Japan into nuclearization in a way that the Soviet Union never risked doing to West Germany. The US threat against China to maintain the bargain is not nuclearization uh, of possibly Japan, South Korea, Australia, and Taiwan, but denying Beijing easy access to institutions of world trade. Okay, so that's the piece that the US has to play in the bargain. These cases demonstrate quite clearly that the priority value for states is security rather than influence, or more specifically, the security of an ally has higher priority than a donor's ability to intervene militarily against that recipient. Eisenhower and Khrushchev were aware very early on of the consequences of nuclear sharing and of the threat of escalation. The world's largest ever nuclear detonation on October 30th, 1961, the 52 megaton Tsar Bomba by the Soviet Union, was a retaliatory signal demonstrating Moscow's displeasure with alleged US assistance to French nuclear testing. Eisenhower thought it inevitable and desirable that the UK, France, and Germany would nuclearize and permit the US to disengage from Europe. Counter evidence in support of the intervention model comes in the form of China's 1992 missile sales to Taiwan and Iran, ostensibly in retaliation for US F-16 aircraft sales to Taiwan. I think that might have been a typo then. China's 1992 missile sales to Pakistan and Iran, right? Not Taiwan and Iran. I don't know why they would sell missiles to Taiwan. I mean, maybe as a way to counterbalance US influence there. I don't know. Here, China was risking nuclear enhancing sales to preserve its conventional military ability to intervene against Taipei. On balance, in the three cases of non-proliferation bargains examined, including the Beijing-Moscow collusion over North Korea, there is very little evidence that states make preserving their influence and ability to intervene a priority. The intention by a state's leaders to create the power to enable intervention against another state typically leads to a breakdown in general deterrence and may also lead to preparations for war by the target state, including proliferation. When a state has accumulated enough influence to conduct a conventional intervention against another state, it may provoke other states in the international system to proliferate. While the US and the Soviet Union both agreed to suppress the nuclearization of their allies as best they could, the US achieved it through consultation and compromise and by convincing the potential recipients that the US was providing a credible extended deterrent. Rather than deny West Germany nuclear weapons, the US floated a number of different options, of which the pre-existing dual-key warhead arrangements seemed the most satisfactory to the largest number of stakeholders. The US and USSR did not engage in any scheme in which they cooperated with each other to jointly suppress each other's minor states. Counterfactually, if the Soviet Union had not been afraid of Germany and had proliferated widely, then the US would have been compelled to do the same, at least among its most reliable allies. If the US did not then share nuclear weapons, its allies would either have done so alone or bandwagoned with the Soviet Union. In either case, the US would have placed little value on maintaining its relative influence through the ability to intervene. Okay, should I read Chapter 5, Wartime Cooperation, the early cases of nuclear sharing? Um, Maybe I'll read the first few paragraphs and then we'll see how relevant it is. Okay, it turns out these chapters on the case studies are incredibly short, so I might as well just read them because it's not going to take that much time. So, without further ado, Chapter 5, Wartime cooperation, the early cases of nuclear sharing. The earliest instances of nuclear sharing were among Allied and Axis peer states during the Second World War. They consisted of non-nuclear states passing on early details of the possibility of nuclear weapons. France's scientific community was the most advanced in comprehensive nuclear research, and as early as the spring of 1939 had considered testing a nuclear device in North Africa. Immediately prior to the German invasion of France in 1940, French nuclear technical knowledge was passed on to the British. Five French nuclear scientists, including Bertrand Goldschmidt, fled to the UK and continued to do nuclear research there and in Canada, ancillary to but outside of the Manhattan Project. They had evacuated to the UK nuclear research equipment and 185 kilograms of heavy water from the laboratory of Frédéric Joliot-Curie before the Germans could complete their May 1940 invasion. The French government had also managed to hide a significant quantity of uranium in Morocco beyond the reach of the Germans, British, or the US for use after the war. By April of 1940, the British, in part through French information, were made aware of the potential for nuclear weapons, but had concluded that the demands of waging war against Germany in the short term would preclude any British effort. The infeasibility of a British nuclear weapons program and concern over German work on nuclear weapons to date were examined as part of the July 1941 MAUD committee report. This report was transmitted to the US, but not until some lobbying by the British, coupled with domestic interest by scientists in the US, did it lead to a strategic awareness of nuclear weapons in Washington. This would eventually lead to the setting up of the Manhattan Project in June of 1942. The trigger was the awareness in the US of both the feasibility of nuclear weapons and apparent German interest in them. The British were initially ahead in both theoretical and practical work on nuclear research, but were unresponsive to early US offers of joint development, preferring instead a loose collaborative effort. By November 1943, a number of British organized scientists were involved either directly or indirectly in the Manhattan Project, including Niels Bohr, Otto Frisch, Rudolf Peierls, James Chadwick, I'm going to butcher these names, William Penny, George Plasek, P.B. Moon, James Tuck, Egon Bretschur, and Klaus Fuchs. The closeness of the Anglo-US relationship would erode over time, despite its affirmation in the 1943 Quebec Agreement and the 1944 Hyde Park Aid Memoir. Manhattan Project Director General Leslie Groves sought to limit British involvement early on in October 1942. The British were further cut off in 1943 when Washington was concerned that the British would pass on sensitive information to the USSR either overtly or as a result of espionage. Congress became increasingly determined after the use of nuclear weapons at Hiroshima and Nagasaki that the US seek to monopolize the technology for as long as possible. The US was concerned very early on with nuclear proliferation, particularly after the first use of nuclear weapons. What collaboration there was between the UK and the US ended in April 1946 with a preliminary study of thermonuclear weapons. France likely benefited from its oblique involvement in the Manhattan Project. Pierre Auger headed the physics department at the Montreal Laboratories, the largest nuclear weapons project outside the US, and Lew Kowarski was responsible for the first reactor to go critical at Chalk River. Free French General Charles de Gaulle, let's go, was kept informed by Auger, Kowarski, Goldschmidt, and others, and was considering the political ramifications of nuclear technology as early as 1944. Groves believed that the British had violated the Quebec Agreement's clause against dissemination of nuclear information to third parties by allowing nuclear information to be passed on to the French. However, France's limited access denied it precise technical information. Next, German-Japanese nuclear cooperation. Germany and Japan each had nascent nuclear weapons programs. Japan had two, a navy and an army program, and the less advanced but more committed Japanese program led Tokyo to seek assistance early on. Germany's War Office centralized fissile and heavy water production as early as 1940, and Japan did the same within its capacity in 1941. The Japanese believed correctly that the Germans would not tolerate nuclear competition, and so hid their real purpose until very late and after protest. In 1943, Japan requested pitchblende, a uranium ore, from German-occupied Czechoslovakia. Germany promised 2 tons, although there are conflicting accounts of how and whether it arrived to Japan. Although Hitler had by that time decided to assist Japan with its material requests, there was no direct contact between the respective program scientists. There was also considerable mistrust between the two states for racial and ideological reasons, and the German military and foreign ministry had a historical preference for China. Finally, The German program, like its Japanese counterpart, had been stuck since the early 1940s in primarily theoretical work. It was Hitler who approved the assistance to Japan, suggesting his final motive may have been to carry on the war and inflict revenge on the Allies after Germany's fall. The Japanese sought from the Germans beryllium, zirconium, thallium, lithium, and uranium oxide, 560 kilograms of which was dispatched near the end of the war. Lithium suggested that the Japanese were at least potentially aware of boosted fission technology. Some of the nuclear materials could have been carried on a few flights between German-occupied Odessa and Japanese-occupied Manchuria. Germany did not, however, share its enabling technologies, such as the A4 rocket or its research on launching rockets vertically from submerged submarines. Germany assigned 3 submarines for the final nuclear-related transfers. The first was sunk, the second never departed, and the third was captured by the United States Navy on May 14, 1945, following signals intercept. The captured U-234 carried 1,120 pounds of uranium oxide when it was intercepted in the Atlantic, sufficient for 2 fission bombs. Next, insecurity causes sharing. The greater the security threat, the more states were willing to share if it ameliorated their security situation. Overwhelming security threats compelled the French to share their expertise with the British, who in turn passed on their knowledge to the US. The French had some appreciation of the importance of planning for the post-war period, whereas the British seemed less concerned by US nuclear dominance. The US, the least threatened of the three, was reluctant to share at the war's end, in part to preserve its power, but also because it believed the British and French had been compromised by communist sympathizers. In the case of access sharing, there was an underappreciation by the Germans of the sensitivity of the help the Japanese were requesting, and only a limited appreciation of the full long-term political implications of nuclear weapons and their transfer. The decision to ship significant nuclear materials to Japan in the last days of the Nazi regime fitted well with the idea of enabling proxies to distract common enemies outside a state's sphere of influence. And that is chapter 5. Now we have chapter 6, even shorter, the nature of off-the-shelf requests. It is unusual for state leaders, unless they fail completely to appreciate the strategic situation donor states find themselves in, to make a direct request for nuclear weapons or long-range missiles, even with substantial funds at hand. One scholar has called this the off-the-shelf nuclear solution, and so far it has never succeeded. Many of these cases have also been accompanied by refusals, often because sharing with the requesting state would have been seen as highly provocative by other members of the international system. Before Libya asked to buy nuclear weapons from China in 1970, their officials visited Cairo, where Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser advised them that nations do not generally sell atomic bombs, at least not if they can help it. Incidents. Here we have a timeline. 1963 or 1965, Egypt asked to purchase nuclear weapons and fissile material from the Soviet Union. 1965, Indonesia boasted, but probably did not make an official request, to China to test nuclear weapons near Indonesia for a deterrent demonstration. In November 1965, Pakistan may have asked China for nuclear weapons, but more likely it sought nuclear technology and a nuclear umbrella. In 1967, Nasser again asked the Soviet Union for nuclear weapons, but the Soviet Union advised him to give up and sign the NPT instead. In 1967, again, Egypt asked to purchase nuclear weapons from China. China advised Egypt to build its own infrastructure. In 1970, Nasser asked the Soviet Union for missiles to counter the anticipated Israeli Jericho rocket, to which the USSR agreed, noting, however, that nuclear weapons were not available. In 1970, Libya asked to purchase nuclear weapons from China, which advised self-reliance. From 1973 to 1978, Libya sought to buy nuclear weapons from Pakistan. In 1974, Libya sought to buy nuclear weapons from India, which refused, concerned about the possible Libyan-Pakistani ties. In the 1970s, in general, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat asked India for assistance to develop its nuclear infrastructure, likely to develop nuclear weapons, but India declined. In 1974, the US refused to provide Israel and Iran, refused to provide Israel and Iran with Pershing 1 missiles. In 1975, the US refused to provide Iran with a decommissioned Polaris SSBN. In the 1970s in general, Iraq may have asked India for technology leading to nuclear weapons. In 1978, Syria sought nuclear weapons from India. In 1985 to 1987, Saudi Arabia is likely to have requested nuclear-related technology from China, besides having purchased CSS-2 IRBMs, which are intermediate range ballistic missiles. In the year 2000, the US refused an Israeli request for Tomahawk cruise missiles. And that is chapter 6. Those were off-the-shelf nuclear purchases that all failed. Next is chapter 7. How long is this one? Ooh, this one is long. What the heck? Maybe we'll skip this one. This is French nuclear assistance to Israel. But then again, I feel like this is topical, right? Like the whole topic we're debating is French nuclear assistance. I mean, it's nuclear sharing. Maybe assistance is just one version of that. But I feel like we should be reading about historical cases of French nuclear sharing that parallel the topic, no? They probably indicate, or at least have carried some indication of how France envisions its nuclear sharing and assistance. So, yeah, why not? Let's read it. Okay. Chapter 7, French Nuclear Assistance to Israel. Israel's political leaders had been interested in developing nuclear weapons since before the foundation of the state, but their active pursuit of them followed the 1955 Czech-Egyptian arms deal, which threatened to overwhelm Israel. Israel's pursuit of a nuclear option was partly the result of an inability to secure an extended deterrent from the US, and partly the traumatic experience of the Holocaust, which caused the Israelis to put a strong emphasis on self-reliance. France's diplomatic defeat in the subsequent 1956 Suez War led it to agree to collaborate with Israel and thereby facilitate an Israeli nuclear weapons program. France's motivation was initially commercial, to sell Israel a reactor, but their shared experience with Nazism during the Second World War and of confronting Arab nationalists, of both being defeated during the 1956 Suez Crisis, and of both being frozen out of Anglo-American nuclear efforts, predisposed them to a joint nuclear effort. However, the actual French decision to build a nuclear weapons infrastructure for Israel was the consequence of determined Israeli lobbying in an extremely fragmentary French executive political structure. Receiving passive executive approval was sufficient for the Zionist sympathetic Gaullists, nuclear bureaucracy, but it is highly unlikely that any strong French executive, led by Charles de Gaulle or any other, would have supported a decision to help Israel to the extent it did. French political leaders, as evinced by de Gaulle's apparent demonstration of regret, made a miscalculation when they agreed to provide nuclear assistance to Israel. First, the strategic context. France had been delivering combat aircraft and other conventional weapons to Israel since 1953, but elite opinion about Israel in Paris was politically divided until the 1955 Czech-Egyptian arms deal showed their common interest. In 1955, in the wake of the 1954 Dien Bien Phu defeat in Indochina, the socialist government of Premier Guy Mollet intensified French military operations against Algeria. Its ongoing war there was fueled by Arab nationalist agitations of Egyptian President Gamal Nasser from 1954 to 1970. The French had a predisposition against Muslim nationalists because of the latter's sympathy with the Axis caused during the Second World War. Israel, which was already involved in a confrontation with Egypt and had already purchased combat aircraft from France, was viewed as a natural ally. The French SDECE, the Service de Documentation Extérieure et de Contre-Espionnage, shared intelligence on the Middle East nationalist movements with Mossad as early as 1954, and Israeli intelligence encouraged the substantial Jewish population in Algeria to cooperate with the French occupation. France sought a powerful counterbalance in the Middle East to offset perceived Soviet Union influence over Egypt, but realistically, Israel could at best distract Cairo. Some in the French elite speculated that Nasser's fall from power would weaken the rebellion in Algeria, though it was never clear how Israel would help France accomplish this. However, Israel's influence in Paris was not robust. Christian Pineau, Mollet's foreign minister, blocked the sale of jets to Israel in early 1956, arguing that the US would not approve the violation of the tripartite agreement. Next, French Zionist sympathies. A major factor in facilitating French-Israeli cooperation was sympathy for the Zionist cause and select members of the French decision-making elite. Most importantly, there were a series of French premiers under constant foreign policy crisis who sympathized with Israel over the shared threat of Arab nationalism. French premiers Joseph Laniel and Pierre Mendès France faced the French expulsion from Indochina. Mendès was himself Jewish, and associated with the pro-Zionist Blum administration in the 1930s. Pinot was a resistance fighter later imprisoned at Buchenwald, and Edgar Faure, while a conservative Gaullist, had also been a member of the Maquis. I don't know what that means. Both had sympathy for the plight of European Jews. Mollet was head of government during the Suez Crisis. Key segments of the military bureaucracy were also very supportive. Many members of this had been lobbied by the Israelis, including Deputy Director of the Israeli Ministry of Defense Shimon Peres, who exploited a network of socialist-based Israel sympathizers. A key factor in Israel's favor was the acquiescence in cooperation by the Gaullist-dominated nuclear infrastructure. The chief administrator of CEA, Pierre Guillemot, like many Gaullists, had served in the French resistance or as part of the Free French during the Second World War. A Jewish brigade operating alongside the Free French at the Battle of Gazala in 1942 impressed many in the Free French. In particular, later key figures Pinot and Diomède Quatreau were impressed. Without Guillemot's approval, no amount of Israeli lobbying through the French executive would have led to the construction of a reactor at the Negev Research Center near Dimona. While de Gaulle was ambiguous in his support of Israel, close observers indicated that he did not object to the participation of Israeli scientists in France's nascent nuclear infrastructure and only sought their exclusion once France could confidently weaponize. Next, the Gaullist nuclear infrastructure. The French nuclear infrastructure was dominated by Gaullists from its inception, and de Gaulle claimed that it was he who created the CEA in October of 1945 to establish the infrastructure for an eventual nuclear weapon. The Gaullist technocrats managed the nuclear weapons program with little legislative or bureaucratic oversight. Guillemot was convinced from his work in the intelligence services that France would be more likely to attain a nuclear weapon if it did so in isolation from the legislature. Insulated from government instability, Guillemot pursued a nuclear weapons infrastructure from 1952. The French nuclear weapons decision, from its inception in a late 1954 meeting with Premier Mendes France, also included key ministers, finance and defense, as well as the Gaullist core of the nuclear infrastructure bureaucracy, such as Guillemot and Francis Perrin of the CEA. A number of Gaullists were also involved in Mendes France's cabinet, including Defense Minister General Marie-Pierre Koenig and Quatreau. Those who opposed nuclear weapons were therefore sidelined, as well as, from 1952, a significant number of communists who had been part of the nuclear infrastructure at its inception. France completed its nuclear feasibility studies in 1954 and completed a secret program for prototype in 1956. This was largely managed in secret at its initial stages by the Bureau d'études générales, created by Guillemot outside of the CEA, using front companies. The installation of the Fifth Republic under de Gaulle in 1958 left the already Gaullist nuclear infrastructure unchanged. Next, the permeable French decision-making process. The Israeli bomb was partially facilitated by an unstable, fragmented, and weak Fourth Republic, with its 14 short-lived coalition governments, in which bureaucrats and industrialists compartmentalized decision-making. The strength of the French technocrats in sidelining the legislature also made possible the Israeli penetration and influence of French executive decision-makers. The French assistance to Israel was never centrally managed, and many of the arrangements were oral, resulting in some disconnects between documented promises and actual outcomes. For example, the EL-102 reactor being built at Dimona was 2 or 3 times as powerful as its initial rating of 24 megawatts. A reactor on such a scale, with such a capacity to produce plutonium, was clearly one designed for nuclear weapons production. The reprocessing plant was not even mentioned in any government documents, and Israel dealt directly with Saint-Gobain through the Société Industrielle d'études de constructions chimiques, so the SIECC, without mention of Israel. However, had de Gaulle been in power, he likely would not have agreed to provide Israel with a reactor tailored for a nuclear weapons program. The instability of the Fourth Republic and the rapid turnover in governments made possible Gaullist domination of the nuclear infrastructure and Israeli influence at the executive level. Next, the French decision to support the Israeli decision. In September of 1956, France agreed to export an EL-3 light research reactor to Israel, a much smaller export than its comparable exports to Belgium, Sweden, or India. This was interrupted by Nasser's July 26, 1956 nationalization of the Suez Canal. This in turn led to a French-Israeli meeting at Sev, I think, on October 22nd to 24th, 1956, in which Israel received verbal promises of a much larger reactor from France in exchange for attacking Egypt on October of 1956. Paris had likely lobbied French Minister of Defense Maurice Bourg-Monnery, I might stop trying with the names, and Foreign Minister Pinot during that period on the benefits of an Israeli nuclear weapon, but it may not have made an impression at the time. The November 1956 failure of the Anglo-French-Israeli invasion of Egypt and their humiliating expulsion by the US set the French political elite on a determined course for a nuclear deterrent. The principal shock to France was the Soviet nuclear threats during the Suez Crisis and French realization that the US extended nuclear deterrent did not cover colonial adventures. Consequently, in Paris, the Israelis found leaders willing to provide them with the nuclear infrastructure necessary to produce nuclear weapons. The Israelis reminded the French of the Soviet threat of nuclear attack during the Suez Crisis and proposed a nuclear deterrent that CEA chairman Francis Perrin, the French Foreign Minister Pinot, and French Prime Minister Mollet agreed to. According to Abel Thomas, the precise promise to help build a plutonium-generating reactor came at a meeting on November 8, 1956, in which Mollet and Bourg, I don't know this name, promised Israel the capacity to build a nuclear weapon. It was at this time that the reactor project likely began, although from 1949, Israeli scientists had been invited by members of the Gaullist nuclear infrastructure to train in France at the Saclay Nuclear Research Center, as well as at Marcoule. The informal nature of France's nuclear assistance to Israel led to a crisis for Israel when in June of 1957, the government of Premier Mollet was preparing to resign before it completed official documentation of the nuclear project agreement. Foreign Minister Bourget, this person, rushed to commit the French promise of to Israel in a formal, though secret, written agreement. This person had been Minister of the Interior when French and Israeli intelligence began their collaboration. He made the finalization of the agreement conditional on the approval of Mollet and Pinot. Mollet, in turn, insisted on the approval of Pinot, whose acquiescence was obtained by Thomas on behalf of Perez. Israel had promised some reciprocal nuclear research. Thomas was responsible for setting up the defense manufacturing sector and managed relations with Israel by bypassing the pro-Arab French foreign ministry. Pinot relented when Israeli supporters assured him that the Dimona reactor would only be used for peaceful purposes. Lie. De Gaulle himself was politically preoccupied at the time with developments in Europe regarding the reintegration of Germany. Although from a political standpoint, the promise of nuclear assistance was ostensibly for peaceful purposes, for those in the French nuclear bureaucracy, it was clear that Israel had intended to develop a nuclear weapon. French Prime Minister Bourges, this person, who replaced Mollet, was equally supportive of French nuclear assistance to Israel in May of 1957 and continued the construction program until his government fell in September. To accommodate his foreign minister Pinot's objection that a revelation could damage France's reputation internationally, the Israelis again deceitfully pledged that the reactor would only be used for scientific research. In September of 1957, in response to France's continued isolation by the US and UK in nuclear-related research, French Premier Bourges, with the French Army Chief of Staff, decided to provide further weapons-related nuclear technology to Israel. Subsequent French premiers did not interfere with the continued operation of the Gaullist nuclear infrastructure support to Israel. Although the new French president, de Gaulle, discovered France's nuclear infrastructure building program in Israel in May of 1958, he took 2 years to reverse it. These 2 years, 1959 and 1960, coincided with the tenure of the Minister of Atomic Energy, Jacques Sostel, who allowed the program to continue. Perrin, the science chief of the French Atomic Energy Commission, confirmed that France had worked with Israel on nuclear warhead design, with a preliminary blueprint delivered to Israel in 1959. The Israelis were present and obtained data from France's February 1960 nuclear test. His replacement, Perrin, subsequently imposed de Gaulle's instructions and in May 1960 dispatched Foreign Minister Maurice Couvet de Mourville to notify the Israelis. Paris flew to Paris to try to salvage nuclear collaboration, but settled for de Gaulle's promise that Dimona would be completed, along with other contracts, including the plutonium reprocessing plant in 1963. The Israelis submitted to French request to make their reactor public, and France reciprocated by agreeing to supply the uranium. The French decision to terminate assistance may mostly have been to do with France having moved its weapon development to the test stage and no longer hedging its bets on Israeli access to US research. Next, French isolation and Israeli technical assistance. The principal motive for France's nuclear assistance to Israel was to exploit as broad a front as possible to develop its own nuclear infrastructure, and the sale of a plutonium generating reactor to Israel fitted well into those plans. France was also particularly frustrated by Anglo-US attempts to deny France nuclear weapons and was eager for collaboration with Israel, especially in 1956 when it finally decided to build and test a bomb. France was far from dependent on Israeli nuclear technical competence, as has been claimed by some authors, given its well-developed technological industrial base. However, France had been isolated from US and UK science and was eager to pool resources with Israel, which it believed had privileged access to the US nuclear program through Jewish American connections. French technocrats, such as Thomas, sought Jewish scientists who had participated or had networked links to the US Manhattan Project or later, and believed the Israelis could draw on the diaspora, the people living in the US. France's collaboration with Israeli scientists was seen as an added benefit at a time when French engineers were still exploring a myriad of design options for their nuclear weapons program. France was particularly interested in Israeli insights into US supercomputer technology, which the US had denied to France. Israel, in contrast, likely sought to network with Jewish French scientists such as Bertrand Goldschmidt to assist Israel. Next, French nuclear weapons assistance. In 1957, France built for Israel a 40 megawatt thermal plutonium producing reactor at Dimona in the Negev desert, theoretically capable of producing between 10 and 11 kilograms of plutonium in a year. It was paid for by financing raised through the Jewish diaspora. In 1959, the project included underground facilities for the extraction and processing of plutonium, laboratories, and waste storage. However, these facilities were insufficient in themselves to permit Israel to build nuclear weapons, especially after de Gaulle's termination of the project left many in skeletal form. Israel had to construct two small uranium processing plants in Haifa. Despite the French Air Force's diversion of 4 tons of heavy water to Dimona, Israel subsequently had to supplement its supply of uranium and heavy water from other sources. Once operational, the Dimona reactor produced 4 to 5 kilograms of plutonium every year, for a total accumulation of about 100 kilograms between 1963 and 1982. Dimona was upgraded from 26 to 70 and finally to 150 megawatts. Israel was reputed to have accumulated enough fissile material for 20 nuclear weapons by 1973. Israeli dissident Mordecai Vanunu estimated that Dimona produced 12 nuclear warheads annually. Israel may or may not have fusion weapons, but almost certainly possesses boosted fission warheads. Without French assistance, Israel would have taken decades to collect the materials and expertise needed to build a reactor on its own. The first phase of French support to Israel was gradually withdrawn in 1959 and 1960, during which de Gaulle was consolidating his power. France's withdrawal from Algeria eliminated its need to offset Arab nationalism and, in particular, Egyptian influence. De Gaulle also sought to capitalize on France's independent nuclear force by taking a leadership position among states eager to avoid either superpower camp. The French agreed to complete the construction of the reactor by 1963 on the condition that Israel publicly declare the peaceful purpose of the Dimona reactor, which it did, but Israel was left to complete the reprocessing facilities, which were finished in 1965. France had an interest in continued low-profile business with Israel. De Gaulle was concerned about the international impact if it became known that France was the only state to have helped Israel develop the bomb, and concerned that it would provoke Egypt into seeking a nuclear capability. After the Israeli experience, France adopted stricter export guidelines and no longer supported the deliberate sharing of nuclear weapons capability with other states. That's important. That's actually very important context. I'm going to read that again. After the Israeli experience, France adopted stricter export guidelines and no longer supported the deliberate sharing of nuclear weapons capability with other states. For the purposes of oil imports, France also shifted its foreign policy closer to Arab interests. However, Paris's contribution to Israel's strategic arsenal continued from April 1963 to 1967, and to a lesser extent until 1973. Israel had tried and failed to reverse engineer a French short-range missile in 1959. So in 1960, it signed a contract with Dassault for a 750 kilogram warhead, two-stage solid propellant rocket, which was tested in 1966. France developed and produced for Israel the single-stage MD-620 Jericho 1 missile with a 280 to 350 kilometer range, and the MD-660 Jericho 2 with a range of 800 to 1,000 kilometers, both capable of carrying nuclear warheads. 14 of these Jericho 1 missiles were delivered before the embargo following the 1967 Six-Day War, and again during an Israeli incursion in Lebanon in 1968. Delivery of 30 Jericho 2 systems, substantially increasing Israel's nuclear delivery capability, was taken shortly after. The last of the systems were delivered in 1970. Israel had also been a temporary participant in France's Mirage 4B bomber program. Next, the erosion of Israeli-French cooperation. The successful French nuclear text, the successful French nuclear test, France's disengagement from Algeria in March of 1962, and its anticipated dependence on Arab sources of oil, coupled with the consolidation of the Fifth Republic under de Gaulle, led to an erosion in French-Israeli nuclear cooperation. France no longer needed the promise of Israeli nuclear technical assistance, and de Gaulle terminated Israeli-French cooperation in late 1960, gradually removing Israeli staff from within the French bureaucracy and recalling French workers from construction projects within Israel, although some contracts persisted for a few years until Dimona went critical in 1964. De Gaulle did not make cutting off of relations a priority, and there was still significant support for assistance to Israel within the government bureaucracy. France continued its cooperation with Israel in the area of nuclear-capable missiles until after the Six-Day War in 1967. De Gaulle's policy was not primarily anti-Israel, but rather to assert French autonomy, as abruptly cut off all nuclear cooperation with West Germany as well. In fact, de Gaulle had dispatched Molay to Israel on May 11, 1959, to pass on the message that de Gaulle, if he had been in power in 1956, would have also provided Israel with a Dimona reactor, and that France assured Israel of future assistance. De Gaulle was initially concerned about the possibility of blowback from the international community and offered Israel aircraft in exchange for putting Dimona under international inspection, not processing plutonium, and refraining from building nuclear weapons. In 1964, French Premier Georges Pompidou assured U.S. Secretary of State Dean Rusk that France would not share nuclear technology with third parties, since Israeli nuclear intentions were not clear to either country. Conclusion. France needed nuclear weapons to improve its security and recruited Israel's technical assistance to accelerate the process. Paris's frustration at being sidelined by the US-UK nuclear effort, as well as the chaotic politics of the Fourth Republic, distracted decision makers from the blowback potential of their association, and de Gaulle's reversal is indicative of France's regret about helping Israel. However, Israel's geographic distance from Europe and France's plausible deniability in assisting Israel, at least until the US adopted the role of Israel's patron, reduced the consequences of the blowback. The easy deterrence model is indeterminate because it depends on whether France can be characterized as a retreating imperial status quo power or an emerging regional challenger to a bipolar nuclear hegemony. The elusive deterrence model is confirmed insofar as the French shared nuclear expertise with a state with which they had many points of sympathy. In 1956, the French felt no interest in preserving a military ability to intervene in Israel. By contrast, the British did seek an ability to intervene in 1956 when they sought to deter Israeli intervention against Jordan, signifying the highly contextual applicability of the intervention model. Okay, Chapter 8 is the USSR, China, the Warsaw Pact, and Cuba, which I think I'm not going to read today. In fact, I'll probably cut the video here, and let's look at the table of contents real quick to see what we're going to read next time. So I think I will actually skip that one. So we've gone through chapters 1 through 7. I'm going to skip chapter 8. I probably will read chapter 9, sharing within the Western Alliance, which I assume is about NATO nuclear sharing. I will probably skip Israel and South Africa. I will probably skip Chinese nuclear assistance to Pakistan and North Korea. I will probably skip nuclear sharing in Pakistan, North Korea, and Iran. And then I will finish off with chapter 13 and 14, which are about soft nuclear sharing and the conclusion. So that will probably be tomorrow. So stay tuned for the end of this book. We've gotten through a lot, low key. It's not the biggest book, but it is a book, and we are almost like we're at least what halfway through. I mean, just about. Especially since we're not going to read some of these case studies. So that's some good work that we've done. I hope you've learned some from this reading. Um, I will again synthesize some of my notes on it when I post my like day four France prep tomorrow, or I guess tonight for those of you watching from the US. So stay tuned for some basic summaries of what I've read today. Thanks for watching.